The late afternoon sun was a distant orange smear in the New York sky, its light trapped and fractured by the glass and steel canyons of Wall Street. Down below, the world was a gridlock of black town cars and yellow cabs, a symphony of impatient horns and the low thrum of powerful engines. Men in sharp suits moved with a predatory urgency on the sidewalks, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones as they barked orders and closed deals. The air itself felt cold, impersonal, and charged with an ambition so thick you could almost taste it. It was a place built on the relentless pursuit of more, a concrete jungle where the weak were unseen and the powerful were insulated from the world by tinted windows and the soft leather of their back seats. This was the heart of an empire, and it beat with a cold, metallic rhythm. Inside one of those luxury sedans, Arthur Vance was the king of his own isolated kingdom. At 48, he was the architect of a financial dynasty, a man whose name was a synonym for success. He wore an Italian suit that cost more than most people's cars and a watch that marked time in increments of gold and steel. As his driver navigated the inch-by-inch crawl of traffic, Arthur was closing a multi-million-dollar deal, his voice a calm, commanding monotone that betrayed none of the chaos outside. Yet for all the power he projected, a profound weariness lived deep in his eyes. It was a hollowness that no amount of money could fill, a ghost from a past where his fortune had been powerless to save his own son. He had since buried his heart under layers of work and wealth, becoming a titan of industry and a bankrupt man in every way that truly mattered. A slight movement between the cars caught the edge of his vision, a familiar annoyance he had trained himself to ignore. It was the boy, Leo, a thin 14-year-old who worked this stretch of road every day. But today, the boy looked different, paler, his usual determined energy replaced by a visible fragility. As he approached Arthur's car, Leo suddenly faltered, a wave of dizziness forcing him to lean against the side view mirror for a brief moment to steady himself. He took a deep breath, straightened up, and instead of just holding out his box of chocolates, he tapped lightly on the glass. Arthur's head snapped toward the sound, his face a mask of irritation. But when their eyes met, the boy offered a small, genuine smile. "Chocolate, sir?" Leo asked, his voice soft but clear. "You look more tired than I am." The words, so simple and so pure, struck Arthur with the force of a physical blow. He ended his call mid-sentence, the silence in the car suddenly deafening. The world seemed to hold its breath in that small, suspended moment. Arthur stared at the boy, truly seeing him for the first time, not as a part of the urban landscape, but as a person. The unexpected empathy from someone who had every right to be bitter had shattered a wall inside him he hadn't even known was still standing. He slowly pressed the button to lower the window, the quiet whir of the motor breaking the spell. He didn't reach for his wallet to buy a chocolate bar. Instead, he heard himself ask a question that had never once crossed his mind. "What's your name? Why aren't you in school?" It is in these small, quiet moments that entire lives can change course, and it is the reason why we feel it's so important to share these accounts. If this story is already moving you, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us to continue bringing these powerful human experiences to light. Leo hesitated, his hand frozen on the door handle of the sedan. The interior smelled of clean leather and a faint, sterile scent of air conditioning, a world away from the exhaust fumes and hot asphalt he knew. Getting into a stranger's car was a rule he had broken only in his most desperate daydreams, but the man's eyes held no threat, only a deep, hollowed-out exhaustion that mirrored his own. Arthur didn't rush him. He simply waited. The silence in the car, a heavy blanket against the city's roar. With a deep breath that felt like a leap of faith, Leo slid onto the plush seat, the door closing with a soft, definitive thud that sealed them off from the world. For a moment, they were just two strangers, a boy and a man, suspended in a quiet bubble of polished wood and glass. The cacophony of Wall Street suddenly a distant, muted film. The car began to move, gliding through the traffic with an effortless grace that felt surreal. Arthur drove himself, dismissing his driver with a quiet word before they'd set off. He navigated the streets with a focused calm, not looking at Leo, but giving him the space to speak. "My mom, Maria, she's sick," Leo began, his voice barely a whisper at first, as if testing the safety of the space. "She used to clean offices downtown, but she can't anymore. I have 2 little sisters, Sophia and Elena." He explained it all with a simple, unadorned frankness. He spoke of the rare blood disorder he'd been diagnosed with a year ago, the medication that cost hundreds of dollars a week, and the crushing weight of being the only one who could keep his family from sinking. He wasn't asking for pity, he was just answering the question he'd been asked. Every word Leo spoke was a chisel, chipping away at the marble facade Arthur had built around his heart for years. He heard the boy's story, but he saw the face of his own son, David. He remembered the hushed conversations with specialists, the impossible-to-pronounce names of experimental drugs, and the gut-wrenching helplessness of watching a life you would die for slowly slip away. His fortune had been a useless mountain of paper then, unable to buy a single extra heartbeat. Now, sitting beside this impossibly brave child who was fighting the same invisible war, the old wound tore open, raw and agonizing. It wasn't just compassion he felt, it was a furious, desperate echo of his own failure, a ghost demanding a second chance at a battle he had already lost once. When Leo directed him to a worn brick tenement building in a part of the city Arthur's car had never before entered, the chasm between their lives became a physical reality. The lobby smelled of damp concrete and fried onions. A group of children played loudly in the hallway, their laughter echoing off the peeling paint of the walls. Arthur followed Leo up 3 flights of stairs, his expensive leather shoes silent on the worn linoleum. This was not the sanitized, abstract poverty one read about in reports or saw on the news. It was real, it was loud, it was alive, and it was the world this boy carried on his shoulders every single day, while men like Arthur debated billion-dollar mergers in sealed boardrooms, miles and lifetimes away. Maria Martinez opened the door before Leo could find his key. She was a small woman with fierce, intelligent eyes that immediately took in Arthur's expensive suit and the profound unease on his face. She pulled Leo into a protective embrace, her gaze never leaving the stranger in her doorway. Her English was accented but clear, her tone polite but laced with a steeliness that left no room for nonsense. She thanked him for bringing her son home, a subtle dismissal in her words. She had seen men like Arthur before, men who sometimes swept into their world with grand gestures, only to disappear when the reality became too inconvenient. She was a gatekeeper, guarding her family's dignity with every ounce of her strength, and she would not let false hope cross her threshold. Arthur, for the first time in decades, felt profoundly out of his depth. The language of negotiation and leverage was useless here. He couldn't command or acquire trust. It had to be earned. He spoke carefully, explaining how he had met Leo, his words feeling clumsy and inadequate. He offered to cover the cost of the medication, to arrange for Leo to see a top specialist he knew. But Maria's suspicion remained a palpable barrier between them. She didn't want charity. She wanted a life where her son could be a child, not a breadwinner. The tension in that small, clean living room was a stark reminder of how hard it is to bridge the gap between 2 worlds. It's why sharing these accounts feels so vital. By subscribing, you help us continue to illuminate these difficult, life-altering moments of human connection. In the weeks that followed, Arthur began to breach that wall, not with money, but with consistency. He didn't just send a check, he showed up. He brought groceries, not from a gourmet market, but from the local bodega, asking Leo what his sisters liked to eat. He found himself sitting at their small kitchen table, struggling to help 10-year-old Sophia with the math problem he hadn't thought about since his own school days. He listened as Maria spoke of her dreams for her children, of the life they had in their home country before everything changed. He wasn't a savior descending from on high. He was just Arthur, a man learning to be present, to listen, and to see the immense wealth in a family's love, a currency his own accounts had long since depleted. A strange and terrifying thing began to happen inside him. The hollow ache of his son's memory started to be filled with something new. It was the sound of Leo's quiet laughter when Arthur told a bad joke, the warmth of little Elena falling asleep on his lap while they watched cartoons, the gratitude in Maria's softening eyes. He was feeling again, and it was petrifying. To care this deeply meant to risk the same devastating loss. His mind, the cold, calculating machine that had built his empire, screamed at him to pull back, to protect himself, to build the walls higher. To open your heart after it has been shattered is a profound act of courage. We believe these are the most important stories to tell, and we can only do it with your support. Please consider subscribing to help us share more journeys of the human heart. The world he came from, however, had no patience for such emotional complexities. The calls from his office became more frequent, more insistent. "Arthur, this quarter's projections are soft," his partner, a man named Henderson, said, his voice sharp with disapproval. "We've got the Kensington deal on the line, and you're spending your afternoons playing Big Brother in the Bronx. Whatever personal project this is, you need to get it out of your system. It's becoming a liability." The pressure was immense, a constant reminder that his new purpose was seen as a foolish, sentimental distraction by the very people who defined his success. He was being pulled in two directions. One life demanding his logic and the other his soul. Then the fragile peace they had built was shattered. Leo's condition took a sudden, violent turn. The fatigue he usually fought became a bone-deep exhaustion that left him pale and breathless. A persistent cough settled in his chest, and one evening his fever spiked dangerously. At the hospital, the specialist Arthur had arranged, a kind but brutally honest woman delivered the news. The current medication was failing. Leo's body was no longer responding. There was one last option, an experimental treatment, a form of gene therapy, available only through a special program in a clinic overseas. It was his only real chance, the doctor explained, but the success rates were uncertain and the cost was astronomical. Arthur sat in the sterile hospital corridor, the doctor's words echoing in his ears as he stared at the initial cost estimate she had given him. It was a figure in the high six figures, enough to buy a luxury home or a controlling interest in a small company. This wasn't an amount one simply wrote a check for without a second thought, not even for him. It would require liquidating a significant portion of his personal assets, a move that would be noticed, questioned, and seen as a sign of instability by his partners and rivals. All his life, he had made decisions based on calculated risk and return on investment. But how do you calculate the return on a child's life? The logical, pragmatic part of his brain was at war with the raw, desperate need in his heart. He walked back into Leo's hospital room. The boy was asleep, his face looking younger and more vulnerable than ever against the stark white of the pillow. Maria sat beside the bed, her face a mask of quiet despair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked up as Arthur entered, her eyes filled with a weary resignation, as if she had already accepted defeat. He looked from her to the sleeping boy, and in that moment, the war inside him ended. The cold logic of finance evaporated, replaced by a simple, undeniable truth. He saw his own son lying in that bed. He walked over to Maria, placed a hand on her shoulder, and met her gaze. "Don't worry," he said, his voice steady and absolute. "I'll take care of it. Whatever it takes." The news from the overseas clinic arrived on a Tuesday morning. The same day, Arthur was scheduled to preside over the most critical board meeting of his career. He stood in the hospital corridor, the scent of antiseptic sharp in his nostrils, listening to the quiet, rhythmic beeping from Leo's room. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a relentless, frantic pulse against his leg. It was Henderson, his partner, then the firm's lawyer, then the chairman of the board. Each unanswered call was a hammer blow against the empire he had built, a warning that the deal of a lifetime, the one meant to secure his legacy, was collapsing. He was being summoned back to his throne, but his feet felt rooted to the cold, polished linoleum, his gaze fixed on the closed door that separated him from a battle that truly mattered. Maria found him there, leaning against the wall. The exhaustion on his face so profound, it seemed to have carved new lines around his eyes. She saw the turmoil in his expression, heard the insistent buzzing of the phone he refused to answer. She approached him slowly, her own grief a heavy cloak around her shoulders, yet her voice was steady when she spoke. "Mr. Vance, you have done so much," she said, her hands twisting a small, crumpled tissue. "You gave my son a chance. You gave us hope when we had none. Please, you do not have to do this. You cannot let your world fall apart for us. This is our burden to carry, not yours." Her words were an offering of release, a dignified attempt to unburden him from a sacrifice she felt he should not have to make. Arthur looked past her, his eyes finding the small glass window in Leo's door. He could see the boy's profile, pale and still against the white pillows, a thin tube taped to his cheek. And in that instant, the sterile hospital room dissolved, replaced by another years ago. He saw David, his own son, looking just as small, just as fragile, tangled in a web of wires and tubes. The memory was not a distant echo, but a living, breathing agony that seized his chest. The same beeping machines, the same hushed despair, the same crushing impotence of a father who could command markets but could not command a single cell in his child's body to heal. He was standing at the same precipice, facing the same ghost, but this time the choice felt different. He turned back to Maria, his gaze locking with hers, and for the first time, the mask of the powerful CEO was gone, leaving only the raw anguish of a grieving father. "I spent a decade building walls of money around my heart, Maria," he confessed, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I thought it could protect me, that it could buy anything in the world. But it couldn't buy my son one more day, one more hour. It was all just paper." He took a shuddering breath, a lifetime of pain and regret pouring into the quiet hallway. "This time, I'm not buying a company. I'm not saving a deal. I'm buying time, his time. It's the only currency that has ever mattered." Without waiting for a reply, Arthur pulled out his phone. The screen lit up with a storm of notifications, a dozen missed calls from Henderson, a string of increasingly furious texts demanding his presence. He ignored them all, his thumb moving with a calm, deliberate purpose as he opened his secure banking application. He looked at the number on the screen, a figure that had once been the sole measure of his worth. Then he looked at Maria, at the tears of disbelief and dawning hope streaming down her face. He initiated the wire transfer, watching the number that defined his old life shrink into something unrecognizable. Then, with a final, decisive press of his thumb, he powered the device off. The buzzing stopped. In the profound silence that followed, he felt no sense of loss, only the quiet and steady beat of a heart beginning to heal. The surgery was a success. The news reached Arthur not in a sterile hospital waiting room, but in a quiet coffee shop miles away, delivered via a simple, tearful text message from Maria. He had, as expected, been unceremoniously ousted from the firm he built, the board citing his erratic behavior and dereliction of duty. His picture was in the financial papers, a fallen titan, a cautionary tale. Yet, as he read Maria's words, the colossal financial loss felt as significant as a misplaced penny. The gaping void in his chest, the one that had echoed with the ghost of his son for a decade, was filled with a profound, unshakable peace. He had lost an empire built on numbers and projections, but he had won a war against the crushing weight of his own past, finally securing a victory that truly mattered. Arthur's support for the Martinez family became a quiet, constant presence in their lives. It was not the grand, detached gesture of a distant benefactor, but the steady, hands-on involvement of a family member. He moved them into a safe, comfortable apartment in a neighborhood with good schools, but his true investment was his time. He was there to help Sophia with her science fair project, to cheer for Eleanor at her first ballet recital, and to sit with Leo during his long months of recovery, not as a savior but as a friend. He was no longer Arthur Vance, the CEO. He was simply Arthur, the man who brought groceries on Tuesdays and had an endless supply of bad jokes. In healing their fractured world, he was slowly, carefully, piecing his own shattered soul back together, discovering a form of wealth he never knew existed. Inspired by a purpose that burned brighter than any stock market ticker, Arthur channeled his formidable expertise and remaining fortune into a new venture. He established the Leo Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to a single, powerful mission: connecting children with rare and life-threatening diseases to the life-saving treatments they couldn't afford. He navigated the complex worlds of medicine and finance with the same relentless drive he had once applied to hostile takeovers. But this time, his acquisitions were not companies, but futures. He built a legacy not of skyscrapers and stock portfolios, but of first steps after surgery, of relieved parents' tears, and of children given the simple, priceless gift of growing up. His work was no longer about accumulating wealth, but about distributing hope. 5 years later, Arthur stood in the sunlit atrium of a newly inaugurated pediatric wing, funded entirely by his foundation. He looked older. The sharp edges of his ambition softened into lines of contentment around his eyes. Beside him stood Leo, now a healthy, confident 19-year-old, his pre-med textbooks tucked under his arm. Together, they looked at a framed photograph on the donor wall, a picture of a small, determined boy selling chocolates between cars on a congested Wall Street. The cycle of pain had been transformed into a cycle of healing, a quiet, powerful reminder that the greatest legacies are not etched in stone, but written in the lives we touch. It is for the sake of these reminders, these testaments to the human spirit, that we are so committed to this work, and by subscribing, you ensure these stories continue to be told,